So hey everyone, and I hope that everyone's staying safe. Today I'm going to give a talk on migrating WordPress and Gitbooks websites to Next.js. So this is something that we've been working on over the past 6 months. I'm going to go more into what this was about and what we are actually going to talk about in the talk today. So I'm a platform engineer at Hash.ai. Hash is basically a simulations and data company. And at the end, I'll talk more about what we do and what opportunities others like you guys might have at our place as well. And the subtitle and what I want to also explain more about is basically demystifying Next.js static site regeneration, because this sounds like it's very complex, but you'll soon realize, like most things in modern web development, it's actually quite easy once you understand what's happening there. So let's get into it. So what to expect? Well, recently, as I talked about, we had a migration from WordPress and Gitbooks to MDX. So MDX, so the website that we are kind of migrated all of our docs into. I mean, we migrated it into our GitHub repository. And if you go into the resources section and either go into glossary or docs, you'll see all of the final markdown files, that MDX files that we had generated. And all of this migration, basically it took happened over 3 steps. So extraction, transform, and loading. So we might have seen these terms online before or even studied it during college, but these steps are like a very essential part of any migration that you're trying to do. So firstly, we had extraction, which is the most basic step and I guess the most easiest, which is basically getting the data from the source. And these documentation websites that we had, which were hosted on Gitbooks and also WordPress, we extracted those sources from there. So yeah, extraction, the sources were basically WordPress and Gitbooks. And for WordPress, the extraction step is actually very, very simple. You just go to your settings page, you click on tools and you hit export. And when you click on export, you'll get a lot of options nowadays. This is a screenshot from an old version of the page. But nowadays you can choose the exact pages that you want to export in case you want to do a large export or you want to keep it small and very, just export a small set of pages. I'll show you how that XML data looks shortly. So yeah, something like this. Let me go into the code and increase the font size as well. But basically, something like this, it's not exactly human readable because it's supposed to be machine readable, but you get all of the pages which were inside of your WordPress database in the XML format. And you can make some transformations to make it more readable, but we'll get back to it shortly. And then we had data from Gitbooks. So Gitbooks is a platform which basically hosts all of your data on GitHub and renders it as a documentation website. So you might have seen some Gitbooks websites online, but in short, it's like a writing platform, and I'll show you how that data looks. So this is one of those pages which was generated via Gitbooks. So it has some front matter data, like Markdown pages generally have. So a description here, not a title, but that's something we added later on. And then basically all of the textual data in Markdown format. So the H1, H2, and then other things as well. Now, there are custom components in both Gitbooks and WordPress that which we were using previously, and we had to convert them into a JavaScript readable format. So I'll get into that as well, because that's actually our second step, which is transformation. So transformation involves basically converting the data into the format that your final destination can read. So since in our case it was Next.js, and with React, everyone likes to use Markdown X or MDX nowadays. So that was what we did as well. And there's actually a good reason behind it, because as I'll soon show you, MDX actually works quite well with any React-based platform. So what is MDX? So to show MDX, showcase MDX, I'll actually go into the final web page that I had built and kind of explain what we had done. So MDX is also a Markdown based format. So you have your front matter here. I mean, your web page would work just as well without having front matter, but it's nice to have that all of that metadata in one place so that anyone can come along and edit it. And then we have the rest of the web page here in Markdown format as well. So you can see it's a Markdown code block with the title of JavaScript. But the difference in here is that we have converted all of our previous components. So I'll go into both Gitbooks and WordPress soon, but just to give an idea. So since we have, here for the Gitbooks page, we can see the hint liquid tag, which I have converted into a hint JavaScript tag, like a React tag. And you can pass in the props directly, like you are passing it to a React component. And similarly below, we have a tabs component, which has other children as each individual tab. So you can see that it's basically like any other React library you might have used, or when you create React components yourself. So yeah, that's basically what MDX is. Now how those components are injected into the actual page, I'll showcase that as well. So transformation for WordPress pages. Well, initially, as I showed you, we actually get the WordPress data in a not so readable XML format. But what you can do, and I do recommend you to do this, is to convert that XML into a JSON, because we are more used to reading JSON data, and we can also use VS Code or any other editor to use code folding and other techniques to go through those pages much easier. So here, I'm showcasing, basically it, I guess, generates an RSS list of all of the web pages that you had. And then, so this JSON data has been converted from the XML data that I already had from an online converter. You can use any tool you want, but I just used an online converter because it was the easiest way to get started with it. And inside of the item key, we have an array of all the web pages which exist inside of your WordPress database. So for each item, we had the title inside of the title key inside of C data. So I extracted all of it out from there for each item. We have a description for each page too. For this one, it's empty, but for other ones, something might be there. So might as well scrape it off via a script as well. And then inside of the encoded C data, we had the actual HTML for the page. So this isn't actually HTML, but it's kind of WordPress HTML. If you've used WordPress's API, you know that it kind of renders it into actual HTML, which you can render onto the page. So in our case, what I initially did for each post was kind of get all of this HTML data out via a script, and then convert all of the HTML to Markdown. So like we have Markdown to HTML converters, we also have converters which do the reverse. So I used some of that. And you can use any converter you want. So this is just one I found online. And if you dump an HTML file on the left-hand side, you'll get some Markdown data on the right-hand side, which you can use directly. However, if we go back to the original page that we had, so I guess this is the first time I'm showing you how the final documentation website looks. We can say that we had some custom components in here. So you can see that most of these things are clearly being rendered from Markdown. So the heading is being rendered from Markdown. These are pages, links are also marked within Markdown. But this component isn't Markdown because it's some sort of a special table that we have used. We call that key concepts internally. But yeah, So how this looks inside of the WordPress HTML. So what I've done on this page is basically taken out one of the HTML pages from the JSON and pasted it in here. And VS Code doesn't really know what to make of it, but we'll just go along and see what's happening here. So this is most of it's pure HTML, like we understand, but then there's things like comment in here which says WordPress ACF key concepts. Now I don't know what any of that means because it's all of this data has been generated by the WordPress. We don't really need to know about, care about what it means as well. We just want the HTML data after all. So as we can see, it's like some sort of a JSON blob, but you can try to parse it yourself if you want, but it seems kind of arbitrary. For example, we have the body tag here. We might have some title tags in there. So this is for the custom components. So instead of doing all of that, what I instead did was hit the web page with an inspect element, and you can go to the component that you have and copy its HTML from here. So you don't need to do this every time. You need to do it only once so you understand how the structure is and how you can input all of the data that you have for this. So, this is just a good way to compare the data that we are getting from WordPress and the data that the final HTML data that we are getting. And you can use this to like convert the page. And yeah, so that was what we did for converting WordPress components. For Gitbooks components, it was slightly simpler because as I had shown, Gitbooks has custom components in the form of liquid tags. So if you've contributed to a dev.to before, you probably know what this is and have also used it before to create embeds and such. But basically, liquid tags are like HTML or JSX tags, but honestly, I don't know why they were created, but they are slightly different, basically. But this is what they look like. You have an opening tag and a closing tag, and the closing tag is generally prepended by end. So in our case for Gitbooks, the tags were pretty consistent across the pages. So replacing them was easy. We could use find and replace, or you could use regex based matching if you want to. So yeah, in this case, this is what we did. So we have a hint tag here, which has a style prop with the info value. And as you know, like if you convert this into HTML or even JSX, this part will work the same, but you might just replace hint with a capital H or something like that. And below we had other custom, I wouldn't say they are custom components because they are just liquid components that Gitbooks uses. So they might be pretty consistent within your pages as well. So we have tabs here, which is a parent component which has two tab child components, which kind of ends up rendering like this. So there's a tabs container, and then each individual tab basically renders some code block, which we are passing in as markdown in here. So this was also converted directly to JSX. As you can see, there's not a lot of difference in the Gitbook side, so it was kind of easier. But before doing all of this conversion, you also need to know how parsing of MDX in NextJS works. So how does NextJS parse that MDX? How do you introduce these custom components? So, you might get confused that, okay, hint isn't a default component in React. What is this hint tag doing here? Or, even tabs isn't a default component. All of these are things that you're probably injecting from the outside, right? And we aren't even using import statements. So I am actually using the library called NextMDX Remote by HashiCorp, which is an excellent library for using static site generation to create these web pages. So NextMDX Remote actually simplifies MDX by a lot because you don't have to use imports inside of your MDX, which you might have seen elsewhere. So initially when I looked at MDX, that was what I saw, and I was kind of, intimidated by it. But in this case, it actually gets quite simpler. So I'll just show the basic example that you have here, and you'll get to know a lot about how it works. So next MDX remote basically can read MDX from an external source, and it's different from next MDX enhanced, which is a different library from HashiCorp, which reads it from the file system. So what's different in here and what's also visible in the example? So if we look at getStaticProps in here, and I'll show later on what getStaticProps does, but basically it allows you to run code on the server side for static site generation. So we have the source here, which HashiCorp has manually inputted for this doc's sake. But as you understand, you can also make an API call and get this string data from an external source. In our case, it was a GitHub repo. And you can run the serialize function on it, through which I guess they're serializing the input for their custom component. And once you pass it down to your page as a prop, so this syntax actually doesn't change that much from repo to repo, so don't be worried about it. This is something you'll probably copy and paste once and then forget about. So you pass down your props to your component, to your page, sorry, and then you pass them down to your component by using the spread operator, and MDX automatically renders it for you. I mean, at least hopefully that's how it should work. And so how did we get those custom components in here? Well, MDX remote has a helpful prop called components, to which you can pass an object which contains key value pairs of your components. So for example, I had hint in there, right? So hint is probably a component that I have created somewhere. And after that, I import it from the external source, and then I pass it down to my MDX remote component. Similarly, I might have other components. So I create a large object containing all of the key value pairs of the components that I may need, and then I pass it down to my MDX remote component. So yeah, I'll go back to my slides. So that's how MDX parsing works. I know that this might be a lot, but you can ask questions as you want, and I'll answer them if it's getting too confusing. But that's how our transformation worked. So the next slide is about data loading, but I'll kind of show how a few of those components worked. So for example, the hint component that I had just displayed. So hint is, as you can see, a plain React component, and it imports data from the outside. Like it might import React Markdown, or it might import some icons which I might be displaying inside. And this is the style prop that I'm passing in here, which you saw here. So if I go to hint style equals to info. So we have props for success, info, warning, and danger in here. And for each of them, we are kind of displaying a different icon, wrapping the div, wrapping it in a parent div and passing a different class name to it. And so you might see a markdown renderer thing here. So I'll just show the default export that this class has, which is basically a circle outline icon, which is an info icon and a markdown renderer passed down. So what this markdown renderer thing does is basically any children which have been passed down to it, it either renders it as the default children directly if it's not a string, or it renders it as markdown. So there's one tiny problem that I faced with NextMDX remote, which was that sometimes it doesn't actually pass down the props as like converted content, but sometimes passes it down as a string. And in case it passes it down as a string, it looks kind of weird because you don't really want your users to see the raw markdown data, right? You want them to see the final JSX. The rendered JSX, not the code, of course. So this is what it does. And I've done this for the tabs component itself, I think. But in the case of tabs, I was able to solve it by adding a new line to each of my pages. So something like this, each of the tab just passes down the children, and that's how we get the code displayed. And I have the tabs component here, which in case children have been passed to it, we render each child in a separate tab. Otherwise, we are just rendering the single tab that has been passed to it, because NTX doesn't really have a way of telling you whether it's passing you an array or a single component there. So that's how the tabs and hint component work. I guess this was too complex, but this is the simplest example I can show you. So if we have a cross MDX component, it can be as simple as this, basically an icon imported from Material UI and rendered in your web page. So yeah, I guess that's enough about how MDX components work. Let's go into the more interesting part, which is about Next.js static site regeneration, or the loading part, basically how do you load and render that data on your web page. So for loading, we basically used before going into it, the three questions on screen: how is the data loaded in, which I was right now going to talk about, but we'll get into soon. How does Next.js know which paths are valid? So Next.js actually pre-renders all of your web pages as static paths if you pass in an array of all the valid paths to it. And then you actually don't need to rebuild your page every time. You can just keep it for building once. You can just build it once, and then by passing certain props, you can allow it to rebuild every time some new data comes in. So for the first question, how is the data loaded in? For that, we can go to getStaticProps. So I guess I am at a different thing in this web page right now, but let me try searching in here. Never mind, I'll just go into the code and show you in there directly. So we have this page, term.txx. Now again, I'm not showing you the actual repository. I've pulled in these files from the actual code base, so don't worry about all the red squiggly lines everywhere. But basically, this is a React web page. And as you know, by the square brackets around term, it is a parameter that we are passing. So term can be anything, and we are using it for the glossary web pages. So we have glossary / some term in here. So for simulations, we have simulation. For data mesh, we have data mesh. And that's how we uniquely identify each page. And through this unique identification, we also map it with a URL in our GitHub repository. So if I go to getStaticProps, so getStaticProps is where the actual magic for the data fetching and the data rendering happens. There's a lot of extra code in here right now, which handles redirects and all of those things, but I don't think we need to get into that right now. We can just focus on getting the actual data in there. So this over here, I'm using awaitpromise.all to fetch 2 data points, the actual text of the post that we are displaying, and all of the posts. I need all of the posts because I'm generating a sidebar where I'm basically showing a navigation for all of the pages that the user can navigate to. So when we hit the GitHub API, in this case, it's just the raw user content, which I'm fetching. We get that into a variable called post text, and I run the gray matter over it to get all of the markdown, the front matter data from the markdown, which I store in the data variable. And I store all of the actual content from post text. I basically pass a reference to post text via content. And then all of this data is again serialized in here via the MDX, next MDX remote library, and then passed to my page via props. And this serialized content, which is probably passed in source, is what finally renders the final web page. And so that's the question of how does MDX, how is the data loaded in? So what we are using is basically getStaticProps, which fetches the data from GitHub and then loads it in there. The second question is, how does Next.js know which paths are valid? So for that, we have a helpful function called getStaticPaths. And what getStaticPaths does is you can pass an array of all of the valid terms or parameters that your page can have, and it will try to render them at build time. So in this case, I fetch all of the posts from GitHub. So we have some sort of a URL map, which is basically an array of objects which contains all of the posts that we have, and it fetches all of the terms from it, which is basically, basically it fetches the slugs from each of those posts, and term it is called term here because that's what we call the parameter in the web page as well. So that's what Next.js recognizes, and we pass all of that data to getStaticProps. So Next.js knows what to pre-render. And the final question about how the pages are kept updated, that's answered by revalidate in here. Revalidate is a prop which allows you to kind of tell Next.js that, okay, after these many minutes, fetch the data again, re-render the page, and display the new data to the user. So, Next.js doesn't know whether the data has actually changed, but at least it re-renders it for us. And this way, you don't have to go back and rebuild the page every time, but get a new page anyways. So in our case, we have set this to 60 into 60, which is an hour. So 60 seconds into 60 minutes, an hour plus one, because GitHub has a rate limit of 5,000 API calls per hour. So we just set it one ahead of that, so we never hit that accidentally. And that's how the data loading part works as well. Now, I don't want to go overboard right now because there are a lot more things I can talk about what we did here. But yeah, that's basically how all of this works. So yeah, happy to take any questions right now.